of the kind of key aspects of this passage is unjust suffering.
Yeah.
And I'm super keen for you to get into that, Jimmy.
Yes.
But before we kind of pull that apart, I think I saw in the Packed 5 house a bit of unjust suffering just on Sunday night at the dinner table with Sarah. Do you want to kind of explain that story a little bit?
Yes. No, thank you for bringing that up live on YouTube. But you're right. You're absolutely right. It wasn't one of my finest kind of parenting moments by any stretch of the imagination. We were kind of sitting down to get ready to watch Lego Masters, and I told the kids that they couldn't get down from the table until they finished their dinner to watch Lego Masters. So of course they can't see the TV from the dining room table. And so when it comes to starting, Sarah's still sitting at the table because she hasn't finished. And I say, no, you got to stay at the table. You can't watch Lego Masters till you're finished. All the while I go and make food while telling her that, and take my dinner to the couch, and I sit down and watch Lego Masters while eating my dinner on the couch, telling her that she couldn't.
Yeah, it was something, and I will say that the look on her face was priceless. It was, yeah, whew.
Yeah, it was something else.
It was.
As was the tantrum that came afterwards when I said, no, you can't sit next to me and eat your dinner like I'm eating my dinner and watching Lego Masters. But, you know, we've talked that out, Sarah and I, and we've kind of, you know, got on the same page. She's acknowledged that she needs to do what Dad says, even if it's not fair. And I've also acknowledged that there are a lot of lazy aspects going on in terms of my parenting there. So we've kind of straightened that out in lots of ways, you know. But as I kind of said last week, you know, I definitely don't get it right as a parent all the time. Another moment, only 2 days after I said that, proving that I'm definitely a work in progress. God's got his work cut out for him in terms of molding me to be like Jesus.
Yeah, awesome. Speaking of last week, a quick cut to there. What did we kind of get into in this 1 Peter? You want to kind of take us back there, what we've been going through?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so last week we had a look at 1 Peter and how he says one of the ways in which you declare and display the goodness, walk the walk and talk the talk, one of the ways you do that in your life and in the life of those Christians in the Roman Empire was to submit to the authority of the Roman emperor, even if he didn't deserve it, because they knew that God had showed them honor, even though they didn't deserve it. So we had a bit of a look at that last week, and now Peter's going to go even further, even deeper into this idea tonight as he kind of speaks to slaves, and particularly Christian slaves. So we're going to kind of unpack that a bit.
Yeah, I saw as we read through that just before, that one of the big questions that may be asked here is Peter condoning slavery in these verses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I think that's quite a common kind of misconception about the Bible, because there are these moments where authors like Peter actually write about slavery. Therefore, the misconception is that the Bible condones slavery. But I think if we look at what the Bible teaches about God and his character and his relationship with people and people that he created, I think we recognize through his love that slavery stands at odds with his intentions and purpose for humanity, for those he's created and loved. And Peter certainly isn't condoning slavery here in this passage, because you've got to remember, who is it and what is it that Peter's seeking to do? When he writes the words here to slaves, his aim here is to write to Christians and to those who are slaves to say, hey, your mission and your goal is to declare the praises and display the praises of the one who brought you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And so we saw last week that included submission and showing honor to Roman emperors and people in authority who might not deserve it. And so he's going to go on now, as we see in verse 18, and say, hey, same deal for slaves. And why don't you have a look with me at verse 18, where Peter says, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. See, Peter's saying, if you're a slave in the Roman emperor and you've discovered the goodness of Jesus, then the way you can display and declare that is by submitting to your master. And not just the good, but also to the harsh master.
Yeah, but if I could just jump in there quickly, Jimmy, surely not. Like, surely if your master is harsh and unfair and they're unfairly beating you up, surely you have the human right to be able to stand up for yourself and defend yourself.
Yeah, you certainly do. The truth is slavery is one of the great injustices and showcases some of the most horrific evils of humanity. And as we kind of look back through history and we see moments where slavery has been abolished and where people stood up and sacrificed in order to get rid of slavery in various places, those people should be celebrated. Those moments should be celebrated, because slavery is an incredible evil. And we shouldn't underestimate even the reality that, or downplay the reality that slavery is a very real thing even now. There are parts of the world and there are people who face the reality of slavery, particularly women and children around the world even today. And we should never downplay the reality of how evil slavery is. And we should fight for the rights and the injustices that women and children and those being kind of sold into slavery are experiencing. And there are organizations like Destiny Rescue and the End It movement and many others that we can and should support as we seek to see justice brought about in the world. It's right to feel angry, and you do have a human right for that justice, to defend yourself in the face of justice. But I think what's helpful to remember is the context to which Peter is writing these words here in to Peter, and who he's writing to. He's writing to slaves in the Roman Empire, where slavery is probably a bit different to how we perceive slavery. But he's writing to Christian slaves to remind them that their mission and their purpose is not themselves and their own justice. It's to declare and display the goodness of the one who's called them out of darkness into his wonderful light. And if you have a look at verse 20, read it with me. He says, "But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God." Peter's saying you're not really displaying the goodness of God if you do the wrong thing and you get punished for it. But if you're unjustly punished, and then you show respect and honor to the one who's unjustly punishing you, well, then you are displaying the goodness and the grace of God, because that's exactly what Jesus went through when he suffered for you. And that's what Peter says there in verse 21 when he says, and again, read it with me, he says, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." So if you suffer unjustly and you submit to the unjust master or authority, then you're demonstrating the very grace that Jesus showed you when he suffered for your sin.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess that's what Peter is unpacking in those final few verses there, eh?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Peter is outlining the incredible suffering and unjust suffering that Jesus experienced. I mean, he says there in verse 22 that he did not sin. You read that there in verse 22. Jesus suffered and died, though he didn't commit any sin, though there was no deceit found in his mouth. And then we read in verse 23 that he did not verbally lash out or threaten those who caused his unjust suffering. You know, I think we probably know the temptation when we're faced with an accusation falsely to sort of lash out verbally, to fight fire with fire. Maybe you have that person in your life, maybe in an online space, who knows you're a Christian, is constantly having a go at Christians. And you know that temptation just to lash out, fight fire with fire and attack back. But Peter says here, no, Jesus didn't do that. Even though he would have been faced with the very same temptation, Peter says here, no, Jesus didn't retaliate. He didn't threaten. Instead, we read in verse 23 that he trusted God. See, Jesus cared more about the approval of his heavenly Father than he did about being proved to be right in front of men. That he left the outcome of his justice in the hands of God, and because he trusted in God, then as we read in verses 24 and 25, he dealt with our sin in his suffering. See, Jesus' suffering, it's so much more than just an example for us to follow. Jesus' suffering, the purpose of his suffering was to put an end to sin and to free his people to live in righteousness. Jesus suffered and died for the sins of his people, to offer forgiveness to those who would come and trust in him, like sheep returning to a shepherd, Peter says there in verse 25. What Peter reminds us is that what Jesus endured for our sin is incredible injustice and suffering.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. Jesus is truly incredible. But on a practical level,
Yeah.
I mean, none of us here are going through slavery right now. Like we're not slaves. So is this passage still important to us today? Like, does it still count?
Yeah, great question. Great question to kind of finish on. We're going to have Q&A in a moment, so definitely hit us up with some more questions that you might have about this. But hey, let me give you two things that I think this passage is really helpful for us. Two things that we can kind of take away from this that's relevant for us. And the first of those is that this passage should helpfully remind us of what it cost Jesus to die for our sin, to pay the penalty for our sin. See, when you read about unjust suffering and harsh masters and slaves, like it might make your blood boil, might make you get angry, might make you feel a really tense emotion, and it should, because it's unjust and it's not right. But Peter reminds us that that's what Jesus went through to pay the penalty for your sin, that he endured that unjust suffering. Despite the fact that he had the power to end it in a second, he left the judgment in the hands of God. He trusted his Father and he endured unjust suffering so that you and I might have a healed relationship with God, that we might have our sins forgiven. And so I think this passage helpfully reminds us just how incredible Jesus is, that he would endure such incredibly unjust suffering for us. It shows us how deep his love for us is, and it proves that we can trust Jesus because he's demonstrated that he is trustworthy at the cross. But the second thing tonight is, I think if you've been a follower of Jesus for a period of time, particularly if you've been a follower of Jesus for a particular time, I think maybe it's easy to buy into the idea that if you're a good Christian, if you do the right things, you read the Bible, you go to church or youth group, you pray, you're generous towards others, you're compassionate, then you won't suffer. I think people buy into this idea, but I think we see in this passage that Peter clearly says that's not the case. It reminds us that, in fact, those who seek to follow Jesus and his footsteps will suffer because Jesus suffered. You know, when I was at uni doing my teaching degree, I did a subject on how to teach the environment to primary school kids, and obviously a significant portion of that unit was kind of taught from the perspective of the evolution kind of theory. And whilst I was in the class, I never kind of sought to make debates or create any conflict. But whenever I was asked a question or whenever I was kind of in discussion, it was evident that I didn't hold to that view, that I believe God created the universe. When it got to the end of that subject and that year, my major piece of assessment, I got a fail, which meant I wasn't able to pass that unit, and it was a prerequisite for that subject. And it became really clear in the comments that were made about that subject that the reason why I had failed was really none other than the fact that I was a Christian and I believed that God had created the universe. Now, maybe you've experienced some sort of unjust bullying, maybe online or at school, or maybe because you're a Christian, you've been left out of a sporting team or an event or a friendship circle because people don't want to associate with you. Or maybe you haven't experienced any unjust suffering, but maybe unjust suffering is just around the corner for you. Maybe there's a moment coming where you will experience unjust suffering because you are a follower of Jesus. I think this passage is really helpful because it reminds us that suffering isn't because we've done something wrong. It's unjust suffering isn't because God has lost control or he's no longer with us. No, I think it's a reminder that comfort and Christianity often don't go together. That if we follow Jesus' steps, we will suffer. And therefore, we'll need to learn to suffer as Jesus suffered. Not retaliating when we're insulted, not threatening when we're suffering, but instead trusting God to right all wrongs. See, you might not get justice here in this life, but I think what Peter reminds us here, that a day is coming where God will show that justice to you. And it gives you hope that that day is coming. So even in the midst of unjust suffering, as Peter reminds us, you can still continue to display and declare the goodness of Jesus, who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light because he suffered for you. Hey everyone, thanks for watching our latest video. It's been great to be with you.
It's been awesome. Please like and subscribe, and maybe maybe check out some of our other content. That'd be awesome.
And we'll see you guys next week.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.